Now we will understand about recursive functions. What is recursive function? I'll just write it here. This recursive functions. We have understood what is functions. We understood the basis of how to create the function, how to determine the values, and how to pass the parameters, right? So what is this recursive function now? When I want to do some task again and again, usually we will be using the concept called as loops, right? Either it is a for loop or it will be while loop. But computationally, if we calculate, this for loop and while loop is very expensive. Mean to say, it actually creates lot of computations, and it takes huge time. If I can consider, if we have a huge data set, the computation time is more with respect to the for loop and the while loop. Okay, if I say computation, I can talk about performance or whatever it is. Like, it might be in terms of time or it might be in terms of space. Okay, so the for loop or the while loop is very expensive. It takes a lot of time. So there is one more way of doing the repeated task again and again. That is nothing but recursive functions. How the recursive functions would work? That's very important, right? If you ask me like how recursive function would work, let us take a simple example of finding the factorial of a number. I'll say something like def, and I'll write a code as fact. I'll accept a number called as x. Then I say if x is equal to 1, I'll name it as fact1, not to confuse you, it is fact1. If x is equal to 1, I'll return 1, else I'll return something like fact, I'll just repeat it as x into fact of x minus 1. This is a simple loop. If you ask me how this will work, let me call something like fact1. Now this function definition, I've defined fact1. Now I'll just call this. Let me say I will call it as fact1. Then I'll pass 5. So how it happens? Let us see it pictorially. I'll give something like factorial of 3 or else fact1 of 3. When I call fact1 of 3, or else I'll just change it to 3 itself, so that letters not be confusing to us. I'll just erase this. I'll make it as 3 alone. When I pass this fact1 of 3, this 3 internally checks, is x is equal to 1? Mean to say this 3 is equal to 1? No, right? So it comes here and say x into fact of x minus 1. That is 3 into fact of 3 minus 1. That is first time what happens. It is 3 into fact1 of 3 into, I'm calling the same fact1 function here. Okay, the same fact1 function. So 3 into fact1 of 2 would be called. Again, the fact1 of 2 internally calls, then this becomes again 2 into fact of 1. Again, this fact of 1 internally returns into 1, because when it is x is equal to 1, it will be returning 1 to us. So now what happens? 3 into 2 into 1. This is returning as 3 into fact1 of 2. This is returning 2 into fact of 1. When fact of 1, it is again returning 1. So 3 into 2 into 1 is the same computation which is actually happening whenever I write the factorial program using the loop. This is what we understood here. But what we can say here is the factorial, when I saw recursive function of factorial, the time computation is actually less and the complexity is also less. Let us look to the practicals so that we'll understand clearly how this would work. I have written a factorial of x, and I told if x is equal to 1, I am returning 1. Else I say return x into factorial of x minus 1, the same code here, right? The same code what is happening here. Now initially what happens? Initially x is equal to 1. When x was 1, what happens? It will return 1. Else what happens? X into factorial of x minus 1. When I am passing the number is equal to 3, when I have factorial of number, that is factorial of 3 is passed here, it checks whether is x equal to 1. No, it is 3. So it comes here, it says 3 into factorial of 3 minus 1, that is factorial of 2. This factorial of 2 again call the factorial function. It checks, is x equal to 1? No, it is 2 now. Then again it comes here. So factorial of 2 minus 1, 1. Now again it passes here. It says x is equal to 1. Yes, now it is 1. So now what happens? 3. And it was factorial of 2, then 2 was written, then factorial of 1, then 1 was written. So 3 into 2 into 1, the same factorial. It happens how it is defined in the below section, like this. For I in range of 1, 4, 1, fact into I. How the loop works, the same way even the function is working. This process we call it as recursive programming. There's a lot of other examples for recursive program. Okay, I can also take an example of how to calculate the sum of numbers from 0 to 10. You can check here. Initially I'll calculate sum of 10. The 10 will go and sit in num. If num, that is if it is 10, then what happens? Num plus calculate sum of num minus 1, then calculate sum of 9 would be written. Then again 9 plus calculate sum of 8, then 8 plus calculate sum of 7. It keeps on repeating. It works just like a for loop. But the for loop is expensive. For that, to avoid the for loop, we can use something called as recursive functions.